Officer Jensen's smug satisfaction lasted exactly 30 minutes. 30 minutes after he'd thrown handcuffs on the wrists of three black triplets for trespassing in a wealthy neighborhood, a single frantic call came in from dispatch. It wasn't a call from his sergeant or even the chief of police. It was from the office of a federal judge, the triplets' father. In that moment, Officer Jensen realized the sickening truth. His actions weren't just going to be investigated, they were going to be prosecuted. He hadn't just put his job on the line, he had gambled with his freedom. Hello, and welcome back. Before we break down every moment of how this officer's career was shattered, we have a question for you. Have you ever witnessed someone in authority make a mistake they would instantly regret? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you believe that no one is above the law, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, let's rewind the clock and see exactly how Officer Jensen's prejudice led him to cross a line that could never be uncrossed.
The afternoon sun of early autumn cast long, clean shadows across the whisper-quiet streets of Cedar Ridge. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a sanctuary, a meticulously curated bubble of affluence where manicured lawns flowed into pristine sidewalks, and the only disturbances were the gentle hum of electric luxury cars and the rhythmic hiss of automated sprinkler systems. For Officer Frank Jensen, this was his kingdom. For 12 years, he had been its guardian, its gatekeeper. His patrol car, a gleaming black and white fortress of order, glided through the streets with the silent confidence of a predator patrolling its own territory. On his dash sat a Top Patrolman of the Year award, one of several he'd accumulated. The residents of Cedar Ridge loved him. They saw him as a bulwark against the chaos of the outside world. He was polite, he was present, and most importantly, he was effective. His method, which he proudly called proactive policing, was simple. Identify anything, or anyone, that seemed out of place and neutralize the potential threat before it could fester. In his mind, he wasn't a cop, he was a curator, ensuring the masterpiece of Cedar Ridge remained unspoiled. He kept the community clean. The unspoken truth, the one that hummed just beneath the surface of his polished professionalism, was that out of place almost always had the same face. 3 blocks away, that face was laughing. The resonance cascade was theoretically sound, Maya Hayes argued, shifting the weight of a backpack laden with textbooks and a freshly won trophy. Our mistake wasn't the theory, but in underestimating the material's tensile weakness under harmonic stress. Call it what you want, her sister Lena countered, a playful smirk on her face. Our robot tore itself apart. It was a glorious, beautiful failure. Anika, walking between them, pushed her glasses up her nose. It wasn't a failure. It was an uncontrolled variable that led to a spectacular data-producing event. And we still won. That's what matters. The Hayes triplets were a force of nature. At 17, they were identical in appearance, sharp, intelligent eyes, hair braided in intricate matching styles, and the same determined set of their jaws, but distinct in spirit. Maya was the leader, direct and confident. Lena was the diplomat, her voice calibrated for de-escalation. Anika was the observer, the analyst, her mind constantly processing the world around her. Dressed in the crisp navy blazers and plaid skirts of the elite Northwood Preparatory School, they were walking the final stretch home, energized by their victory at the state-level STEM competition. They belonged here. Their sprawling colonial home, with its deep blue shutters and a porch swing their father had built, was just 2 blocks away on Elm Street. As they turned onto the sun-drenched quiet of Magnolia Drive, the serene atmosphere was broken. Officer Jensen's patrol car slowed to a crawl beside them. Through his tinted window, his curated reality snapped into sharp focus. 3 black girls. Pricey school uniforms. Expensive-looking backpacks. In Cedar Ridge, the equation didn't compute. His internal alarm, honed by years of unchallenged bias, blared. They don't belong here. He made a smooth, deliberate U-turn, the tires of his cruiser making no sound. He pulled up behind them, the sudden red and blue flash of his light bar painting the trees in jarring strokes of color. You 3. Stop right there. The voice from the car's PA system was clipped, devoid of warmth, an order that expected instant compliance. The triplets froze, their conversation cut short. They exchanged a look, not of panic, but of a weary, familiar dread. It was the look that every black child learns after having the talk with their parents. A look that said, here we go. Be calm. Be perfect. Survive. Officer Jensen stepped out of his car, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered Glock. It wasn't a threat, not officially, but it was a clear statement of power. I'm going to need to see some identification, he said, his eyes scanning them not as teenage girls, but as anomalies. And you're going to tell me what you're doing in this neighborhood. Of course, officer, Maya said, her voice steady as she reached slowly into her blazer. We live here. Our house is on Elm Street, just 2 blocks away. She produced her Northwood Prep student ID card, a high-quality piece of plastic with a holographic seal and a clear, smiling photo of herself. Anika and Lena did the same. Jensen took Maya's ID, turning it over in his hands, his thumb rubbing the surface as if trying to find a flaw in a cheap forgery. He held it up to the light, his expression a mask of profound skepticism. Northwood Prep, he said, the name of the school tasting like an insult in his mouth. He looked from the picture to her face. Girls like you don't go to Northwood Prep. The invisible line had been crossed. The thin veil of procedure was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of his prejudice. Sir, with all due respect, we do, Lena interjected, her tone impeccably polite. We can call our parents if you'd like. Our father is Federal Judge Marcus Hayes. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Jensen let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure derision. A federal judge? That's a good one. A desperate lie from a desperate kid. To him, this wasn't a plausible explanation. It was the most audacious falsehood he had ever heard, a clear sign of criminal thinking. Their composure wasn't innocence, it was defiance. Their intelligence wasn't a credit to them, it was a tool they were using to mock him. Ma'am, step away from my stop, he barked suddenly, his head snapping toward a woman who had come out of her house, a watering can still in her hand. Frank, for heaven's sake, what are you doing? The woman, Mrs. Gable, exclaimed, her face etched with confusion. I know these girls. They're the Hayes triplets. They live on Elm Street with Marcus and Imani. It was the final off-ramp, a chance for Jensen to reverse course, to listen to the clear testimony of a resident he knew and trusted. But he was too far down the road. Mrs. Gable's intervention wasn't a clarification. It was an obstruction, a challenge to his authority. His frustration boiled over into a cold, decisive rage. That's enough, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing calm as he turned back to the girls. You're trespassing in a private community, you've provided falsified identification, and you're lying to a police officer. You are all under arrest. A collective gasp escaped the triplets. Mrs. Gable cried out, Frank, no. But it was too late. He was already pulling out the cold, heavy steel of his handcuffs. He started with Maya, grabbing her wrist with a practiced, painful efficiency. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs locking into place echoed in the unnatural silence of the street. One by one, he cuffed all 3 of them, ignoring their quiet, dignified protests. He saw no honor students, no daughters, no children. He saw only the confirmation of his own bias, 3 criminals who had dared to cross an invisible line into his perfect, clean world. And he, the guardian, had done his job. A profound, smug satisfaction settled over Officer Frank Jensen. He sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, the engine humming a low, steady thrum of authority. In the back, the 3 girls were silent, their hands cuffed behind them. To him, their silence wasn't dignity, it was the sullen quiet of the guilty. He had done his job, and done it well. He had seen a threat, confronted it, and neutralized it. The neighborhood was safe once more. Mrs. Gable could go back to watering her petunias, secure in the knowledge that he was on watch. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching his own reflection, the steady, determined eyes of a protector. He picked up his radio handset, the familiar weight of it comforting in his palm. The whole process, from the initial stop to this moment, had taken less than 30 minutes. Efficiency. That's what they paid him for. Dispatch, this is Unit 714, he began, his voice a smooth, professional baritone. Show me en route to central booking with 3 female juvenile detainees. Charges are trespassing, failure to identify, and providing false information to an officer. He clicked the receiver, a crisp, final sound. The paperwork would be a minor annoyance, but it was a small price to pay for maintaining order. For a moment, there was only the crackle of static in reply. Then, the dispatcher's voice came through, but it was wrong. The usual bored, monotonous tone was gone, replaced by a strained, high-pitched urgency that made the hair on Jensen's arms stand up. "Frank, what is the current status of the Hayes triplets?" The name hit him first. Hayes. The dispatcher used their last name, not the detainees or the suspects. It was a small detail, but it was a crack in the foundation of his certainty. He keyed the mic to respond, a flicker of irritation rising in him. "Dispatch, they are secured in my vehicle. We are en route to booking, as I just stated." Before he could release the button, the dispatcher's voice cut back in, now laced with sheer, undisguised terror. The words tumbled out, fast and sharp, like shrapnel. "Negative, 714. Abort. The U.S. Marshals Service is on the line. They demand your exact location. Judge Marcus Hayes is en route. You are ordered not to move. I repeat, do not move your vehicle." The radio fell from Jensen's hand, clattering uselessly onto the passenger seat. The world outside his windshield seemed to warp and lose focus. U.S. Marshals Service. The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of his mind. This was no longer a local matter. This was federal. The name, the one he had laughed at just minutes ago, came back to him, but this time it wasn't a teenager's lie. It was a hammer blow. Judge Marcus Hayes. Cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over him, a physical sensation like being plunged into ice water. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Judge Marcus Hayes. Not just any judge. He was the Judge Hayes, a legal titan, a man whose picture had been in the national news, a constitutional scholar appointed to the federal bench for a lifetime term. A man known for his landmark rulings on civil rights cases. A man who had dismantled corrupt police departments with the stroke of a pen. His hands felt numb on the steering wheel. Slowly, as if moving underwater, he lifted his eyes to the rearview mirror. He didn't see 3 sullen delinquents anymore. He saw 3 composed, intelligent young women sitting perfectly still. Their expressions weren't angry or scared. They were watching him. Their calm, which he had so arrogantly mistaken for defiance, was something else entirely. It was the unshakable composure of those who possess a power so immense, they have no need to display it. They were simply waiting for the world to realign itself to the truth. In that horrifying, crystal-clear moment, Officer Jensen understood. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed an act of professional suicide. He hadn't just arrested 3 teenagers. He had arrested the daughters of one of the most powerful men in the justice system. The invisible line he had spent his career guarding had been crossed, but it was he who was on the wrong side. And the consequences were not just coming for him. They were already here.
There was no siren. Sirens are a cry for help, an admission that control has been lost. What arrived on Magnolia Drive was the antithesis of chaos. It was a force of absolute tectonic certainty. A black Escalade, gleaming like a shard of polished obsidian, materialized at the end of the street. It didn't speed, it proceeded, its movement a silent, inexorable tide that seemed to command the very air to be still. Adorned with official government plates and tinted windows that absorbed the golden afternoon light, it pulled to a stop behind Jensen's cruiser. Its imposing form seemed to suck the energy from the flashing red and blue lights, rendering them cheap, frantic, and utterly powerless. Inside his car, Frank Jensen felt the world constrict. The air grew thick, heavy, and hard to breathe. He was no longer a guardian in his fortress. He was a fish in a bowl, trapped under the gaze of an approaching leviathan. He tried to assemble a narrative, a version of events that could save him. Reasonable suspicion, proactive policing. They were uncooperative. They lied. The words felt like sand in his mouth, flimsy and useless against the approaching reality.
The driver's side door of the Escalade opened. A man stepped out. He was not wearing the imposing black robes of a federal judge. He wore a simple gray cashmere sweater, dark, perfectly pressed slacks, and burnished leather shoes. And that, in a way that defied all logic, made him infinitely more terrifying. This wasn't the office. This was the man. This was Judge Marcus Hayes, and his authority wasn't in a uniform. It was etched into the very core of his being. He began to walk toward the patrol car. It wasn't a walk. It was a procession. Each step was deliberate, measured, eating up the ground between them with an unhurried, devastating purpose. Jensen watched him come, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He'd seen that face before, on the national news, during a contentious Senate confirmation hearing. A face of intellect, integrity, and an iron will that had buckled far more powerful men than a beat cop from Cedar Ridge. Simultaneously, the passenger door opened. Dr. Imani Hayes emerged. Where her husband was a portrait of lethal calm, she was a vortex of focused, silent fury. Her eyes, the sharp, assessing eyes of the city's top trauma surgeon, did not even graze Jensen. He was an irrelevance, a piece of faulty equipment that had malfunctioned and caused injury. She saw only one thing: her children in the back of a police car. She moved with a surgeon's purpose, her steps swift and sure, her Fendi bag swinging slightly with the clipped efficiency of her stride. Reaching the rear door, which Jensen had left unlocked in his haste, she pulled it open with a firm, decisive motion. From her bag, she produced not a phone, but a small, single key, a spare handcuff key. A key a mother should never have to own, let alone carry. A key that spoke of a lifetime of preparing her children for a world that would see them as threats before it saw them as treasures. Maya, Anika, Lena, look at me, she commanded softly, her voice a lifeline in the suffocating tension. She leaned in, her presence a protective shield. With practiced, steady hands that had pieced together human bodies in the chaos of an operating room, she unlocked the cuffs on Maya's wrists. The metallic snick of the release was a sound of liberation. "Breathe, baby," she whispered, her fingers briefly checking the pulse at her daughter's wrist. She moved to Anika, then Lena, repeating the process with the same calm precision. Her touch was a clinical assessment and a loving reassurance all at once, checking for bruises on their skin and the invisible abrasions on their souls. Her silence was a condemnation louder and more profound than any scream could ever be. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes had reached Jensen's driver's side window. He didn't tap on the glass. He didn't gesture. He simply stood there, his presence an immense weight, his shadow falling over the officer. Jensen sat pinned in his seat, a statue carved from pure dread. In the judge's eyes, he saw no anger, no rage. He saw something far worse, a vast, cold, and final disappointment. He saw the dispassionate gaze of a man who had already reviewed the evidence, considered the arguments, and passed sentence. After a heart-stopping eternity, Jensen's trembling hand found the button, and the window slid down with the faint whir of an electric motor. The judge spoke. His voice was not loud, but it seemed to vibrate in the very molecules of the air, a low, precise instrument of retribution. "Officer Frank Jensen," he began, the use of his full name making it sound like the first line of a federal indictment. "You have illegally detained 3 minors without cause. You have violated their Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure." He paused, letting the weight of the constitutional crime settle into the space between them. "I have already spoken with the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. You will be hearing from the United States Attorney's Office before the sun sets today." It wasn't a threat. It was a weather forecast, a simple, factual statement of an approaching, unstoppable storm. Just then, a second patrol car, which had been approaching without sirens, slid to a halt. Jensen's sergeant, a portly man named Miller with a perpetually panicked expression, scrambled out. He was a man who saw the world in terms of political fallout, and his face was ashen. "Judge Hayes, sir," he blurted out, rushing forward. "Sergeant Miller. Sir, there has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Officer Jensen is one of our most decorated officers. I'm sure we can sort this." The judge turned his head slowly, a fraction of a movement. His gaze shifted from Jensen to the sergeant. The power of that look, the sheer, unassailable weight of his position, silenced the man mid-sentence. Miller's pathetic attempt to control the narrative evaporated in the face of true authority. Judge Hayes addressed the sergeant, but his words were a public verdict on Jensen, a final, brutal stripping of everything the man thought he was. "Sergeant," the judge stated, his voice dropping to the cold, hard finality of a gavel striking wood. "Your officer is a federal liability. He is a danger to this community and a disgrace to his badge." He pointed a single, steady finger at Jensen. "Secure his weapon, and secure his badge." He added one more word, a command that shattered the chain of command and remade it in his own image. Now, Sergeant Miller, pale and sweating, looked at Jensen with a mixture of pity and terror. There was no choice. He was no longer a sergeant giving an order. He was a subordinate following one from a higher power. "Frank, give me your weapon," he stammered. Before the entire world, before Mrs. Gable on her lawn, frozen in horror, before the Hayes triplets, now standing free and encircled by their mother's arms, before his own superior officer, Frank Jensen had to unholster his Glock and hand it over but first. The weight leaving his hip felt like a part of his soul being torn away. "Your badge, Frank," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. With a shaking hand, Jensen reached for the shield on his chest. The sharp, metallic rip of the Velcro, tearing it from his uniform, was a sound of total severance. It was the sound of a career, an identity, and a man being publicly dismantled, piece by humiliating piece. He held the badge in his palm for a second, the symbol of a power he had so profoundly abused, before his sergeant gently took it from his grasp, as if plucking it from a dead man. Before the black Escalade had even turned off Magnolia Drive, the digital storm had broken. Mrs. Gable's doorbell camera, a silent, unblinking witness, had captured everything. Jensen's condescending tone, the triplets' calm dignity, his sneering dismissal of their father's identity, the public humiliation of his disarming. The video, uploaded to a neighborhood watch group by her horrified son, had jumped the digital fence in minutes. From there, it went supernova. By the time Jensen arrived home in a taxi, stripped of his authority and shrouded in a daze of disbelief, his phone was a vibrating, buzzing brick of social poison. News alerts flashed his name. His face, contorted in a mask of arrogant certainty, was the thumbnail for a dozen viral clips. The hashtags were brutal. Hashtag Cedar Ridge Cop, hashtag Judge Hayes Daughters, hashtag Badge and Bias. He was no longer a person. He was a meme, a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. He watched in numb horror as the view counter on one video clicked past 1 million, then 2. His entire life, his 12 years of service, had been reduced to a 2-minute clip of his worst self. The chaos from the outside world soon breached the walls of his home. A call from his chief of police, a man who had shaken his hand at award ceremonies, was curt and cold. There was no support, no "we'll get through this." There was only frantic, terrified distance. "Frank, you're on indefinite unpaid leave, effective immediately. Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave your house. You've brought a firestorm on this department." The line went dead. An official email followed, its language a sterile, legalistic severing of ties. The Oakwood Police Department, the institution to which he had dedicated his life, was not just throwing him under the bus. They were strapping him to the front bumper and driving it headfirst into a concrete wall. His union representative's call was even more telling. The usual bluster and bravado were gone, replaced by a weary, pragmatic fear. "Frank, we'll make a statement about due process," the rep sighed. "But you need to understand what you've done. You didn't just arrest some kids. You went after the daughter of a federal judge. This isn't internal affairs, Frank. This is the DOJ. This is a different league, and we're not equipped to play." The message was clear. They would make noise, but they knew a lost cause when they saw one. He was on his own. His job wasn't just on the line. It had already been incinerated. The true nature of his predicament arrived 2 days later. Not with a phone call, but with a sharp, authoritative knock on his door. 2 people stood on his porch, a man and a woman, dressed in crisp, dark suits. They didn't look like cops. They radiated an unnerving, bureaucratic calm. "Officer Jensen," the woman said, flashing a badge. "FBI. We need you to come with us. A car is waiting." The interrogation room was not like the ones at his precinct. There were no scuff marks on the walls, no faint smell of stale coffee. It was a sterile, soundproof box, painted a soul-crushing shade of off-white. There was a single steel table and 3 chairs. Jensen sat on one side. The 2 stone-faced FBI agents, who introduced themselves as Agent Sullivan and Agent Croft, sat on the other. They didn't ask him how he was feeling. They didn't ask for his side of the story. They simply placed a thick, 3-ring binder on the table between them. The thud it made was a sound of finality. "Officer Jensen," Agent Sullivan began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "we are conducting a criminal investigation into a pattern of practice in potential violation of United States Code, Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law." Agent Croft opened the binder. "Let's start with your traffic stops," she said, sliding a color-coded chart across the table. "In the last 3 years, you have conducted 412 traffic stops in the Cedar Ridge precinct. 318 of those stops involved non-white drivers. That's 77% of your stops in a community that is 92% white. Can you help us understand that statistical anomaly? Jensen stared, his mouth dry. Proactive policing. I stop suspicious vehicles. Like Dr. Eris Thorne? Sullivan cut in, flipping a page. A black neurosurgeon at Oakwood General. You pulled him over in his brand-new Mercedes last April for a cracked taillight. His vehicle maintenance records, which we've subpoenaed, show his car had received a full dealership inspection 2 days prior. No cracked taillight was noted. You cited furtive movements and conducted a search of his vehicle. You found nothing. Of the 318 stops of non-white drivers, you initiated searches in 127 of them. Of the 94 stops of white drivers, you initiated a search twice. Can you explain that? Croft flipped another page. Let's talk about field interviews. Suspicious persons. Like 16-year-old David Chun, an Asian-American high school student who was sitting on a park bench last summer. Your report says he was casing the houses. His mother says he was waiting for her to pick him up from tutoring. You detained him for 45 minutes. You ran his name for warrants. He had none. He has a 4.0 GPA and is a concert violinist. She didn't wait for an answer. Or what about the loitering complaint you responded to? A group of Hispanic landscapers eating their lunch in their work truck. You demanded to see their green cards. Is that standard procedure for the Oakwood PD officer? Sullivan slid another document forward. It was a transcript of one of his own reports, with certain words highlighted in yellow. This is your report on a domestic disturbance call. A white couple. You described the husband as agitated and emotional. Now here, he slid another transcript next to it, is a similar call for a black couple. You described the husband, who used almost identical language, as aggressive and hostile. It seems, officer, that in your view, white people get emotional. Black people get aggressive. That's a pattern we see in over 200 of your incident reports. They went on, for what felt like an eternity. Each page of the binder was a sin he had long since forgotten, a casual abuse of power he had justified as good police work. A stop, a search, a detention, all of it laid bare, not as isolated incidents, but as an undeniable mathematical pattern of prejudice. The agents weren't accusing him. They were showing him, with cold, hard data, who he truly was. The man in that binder was a bigot who used his badge as a weapon. Finally, Agent Sullivan closed the book. The illegal detention of the Hayes triplets was not an aberration, Officer Jensen. It was the culmination of a career. It was your pattern, finally applied to the wrong person. Agent Croft leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. A conviction under Section 242 carries a sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison for each count. With 3 victims in this single incident, a federal prosecutor will be looking at a significant amount of time. 10 years. The number hung in the sterile air of the room, a tangible, terrifying thing. Federal prison, not county jail. The reality crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. This was no longer about his career, his reputation, or his pension. His entire world had been stripped away, piece by piece, until only one stark, horrifying reality remained. His freedom was on the line. The police union hall wasn't in a gleaming downtown office building. It was a squat, brick fortress in an older part of the city with thick, tinted windows that let nothing in and showed nothing out. Inside, the air was stale with the ghosts of 1,000 cigars and a million grievances. It felt less like a legal office and more like the back room of a social club, a place where loyalty was currency and the outside world was the enemy. Frank Jensen sat across a heavy oak desk from Sal DeFranco, the union president. Sal was a man carved from pure cynicism, a former street cop who had traded his badge for the intricate, brutal politics of the family. He didn't look at Jensen with sympathy. He looked at him like a problem to be managed, a piece on a chessboard drenched in blood. "Let's be clear, Frank," Sal began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "The department, the brass, they're done with you. They're cutting you loose to save their own skin. They'll talk about accountability and new directions, but we know what it is. They're feeding a soldier to the wolves to keep the pack away from their own door." He paused, letting the image of betrayal hang in the air. "But you're one of us, Frank. You're family, and the family takes care of its own, as long as you remember the rules." Sal laid out the gambit. It was a classic play, one he'd run a dozen times before. The union would publicly decry the witch hunt. They would frame Jensen as a dedicated officer, a hero even, who made a split-second decision in a hostile anti-police climate. They would paint the Hayes triplets as disrespectful and their father as a vindictive official using his power to crush the little guy. "We'll make you a martyr, Frank," Sal said, a cold gleam in his eye. "We'll raise money for your defense. We'll put your picture on billboards. The narrative is that the system chewed you up and spit you out. You become the symbol of every cop who's afraid to do their job anymore." Jensen felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by Sal's next words. "But for this to work," Sal continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you have to play your part. You are the lone gunman, the bad apple. It was your mistake, your bad day. It had nothing to do with training or precinct culture or the way things have always been done. You keep your mouth shut about everything else. You take the hit. You do the time if it comes to that. You show them you're a stand-up guy. And when it's all over, the family will be there. A pension, a job somewhere private. We make you whole." The unspoken threat was deafening. If you talk, if you become a rat, you are no longer family. And we don't protect rats. The meeting with his court-appointed lawyer, a harried, perpetually exhausted man named Miller, was a splash of cold, brutal reality. There was no talk of family or loyalty in Miller's cramped, paper-strewn office. There was only the law. "They have you, Officer Jensen," Miller said bluntly, not bothering to soften the blow. "They have you on video, they have a dozen prior complaints, and they have statistical data that paints a picture of you as a one-man civil rights violation. The union's martyr strategy? It might win in the court of public opinion, but a federal jury will eat you alive. You'll be sentenced before the press conference is even over." Jensen felt the walls closing in. "So what do I do?" Miller leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "This is where it gets interesting. I received a back-channel communication, an informal inquiry from the U.S. Attorney's Office." He slid a legal pad across the desk. On it was a single name, Judge Marcus Hayes. "The judge isn't interested in you," Miller explained, his eyes locking onto Jensen's. "Not really. Sending one cop to prison is easy. It's a headline for a week. He's after something much bigger. He's not interested in the soldier who pulled the trigger. He's interested in the entire crime family that trained him, armed him, and told him where to point the gun." The analogy hit Jensen with the force of a physical blow. "They're talking about a full-scale federal intervention," Miller continued. "A consent decree. They want to gut the Oakwood PD's training protocols, their promotion system, their entire culture. And to do that, they need someone on the inside to testify. They need a witness." The choice was laid bare, stark and terrible. On one side was Sal DeFranco's world. Take the fall, be a stand-up guy, do the time, and trust the family to catch you. On the other was the federal government's offer: become a rat, betray every principle of the blue wall of silence he had lived by, and in exchange, save himself from a decade in prison. Scapegoat or witness. That night, the house was silent. His wife had taken to sleeping in the guest room, the space between them a cold, unbridgeable chasm. Jensen sat in his armchair in the dark, the two options grinding away at his soul. The thought of betraying his brothers in blue, of being branded a snitch for the rest of his life, was a poison. But the thought of a federal prison cell was a suffocating terror. He heard a soft footstep on the stairs. His 15-year-old son, Dylan, stood in the doorway, his face pale in the gloom, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. The boy had been avoiding him for days, a ghost of shame in their own home. "Dad." Dylan's voice was small, fragile. Jensen couldn't bring himself to look at his son. "Go to bed, Dylan. I have to ask." The boy took a hesitant step into the room. "The kids at school, they're saying things. They showed me the video." He choked on a sob. "Dad, did you really do what they're saying? Did you really arrest those girls just because they were black?" The question was not an accusation. It was a plea. A child's desperate, heartbreaking plea to be given a reason to still believe in his father. It was a question that cut through all the noise. The union's code of honor, the lawyer's strategic calculus, the FBI's threats. It was a simple moral question. And in the crushing, absolute silence of the room, Frank Jensen knew he had no answer that could defend his actions. His loyalty to the family had cost him his own. The choice was no longer a choice. He looked at his son's shattered face, and the blue wall of silence came crumbling down. The deposition room was the polar opposite of the Union Hall's shadowy warmth. It was a place of cold, hard light and unforgiving clarity. Located on the 12th floor of a federal building, its large windows overlooked the city, but the view offered no comfort. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the sterile fluorescent lights above. At one end sat 2 assistant U.S. attorneys and the same 2 FBI agents, Sullivan and Croft. A court stenographer's fingers hovered over her machine, ready to turn his words into an indelible, official record. On the table, a small, high-definition camera with a single red light stared at him, an unblinking eye of judgment. This was not a place for loyalty or brotherhood. This was a place for truth. Frank Jensen sat alone, his lawyer beside him. He felt a strange, hollow calm. The agonizing decision was over. All that was left was to speak. "Mr. Jensen," the lead prosecutor began, "please state your name for the record." "Frankie Jensen," he replied, his voice flat. "And for the past 12 years, you were a sworn officer of the Oakwood Police Department." "Yes." "Mr. Jensen, we are here to discuss the culture and unofficial practices of the Oakwood PD. I want you to walk us through how a rookie officer is taught to police a neighborhood like Cedar Ridge." Jensen took a deep breath. This was it, the point of no return. He looked directly into the camera's lens, as if speaking to every cop he had ever known. "It starts your first week out of the academy," he began, his voice steady. "Your field training officer, your FTO, he takes you aside. He calls it the real talk. He tells you to forget the community policing nonsense they taught you in class. The real job, he says, is keeping the peace, and you do that by knowing who doesn't belong. You learn the codes." "What codes are those?" Agent Croft asked, leaning forward. "Fishing or casting the net," Jensen said. "That's what we called it. You find a pretext, a minor traffic violation, walking on the wrong side of the street, anything, to stop someone who looks out of place. The goal isn't a ticket. It's an ID check, a warrant search, a way to put them on notice. We see you. We were taught to call it proactive policing in our reports." He detailed how supervisors, including his own sergeant, encouraged this. The metrics were everything. High stop numbers, high field interview counts. That's what got you good assignments and praise. No one ever asked why 80% of your stops in a white neighborhood were black or Hispanic drivers. As long as the numbers were high, you were a good cop. The unspoken rule was, the people who live there won't complain, and the people who are just passing through don't have a voice. The prosecutor prompted him about report writing. "We had a saying," Jensen confessed, a bitter taste in his mouth. "Articulate and handcuff." It meant you learned how to write a report that could justify anything. You used the magic words, furtive movements, smell of intoxicants. Subject became belligerent. "I feared for my safety." You learned to turn a citizen's confusion into noncompliance, and their frustration into aggression. You write your report not to reflect what happened, but to survive a lawsuit. I was good at it. I taught rookies how to do it. For 2 hours, he gave them everything. He broke the sacred, unspoken oath of the blue wall of silence. He named the sergeants who would lose minor citizen complaints. He described the informal system of intimidation, where if an officer got a complaint, 2 of his buddies would park their cruisers outside the complainant's house for a few nights, a silent message to drop it. He didn't make excuses for arresting the Hayes triplets. "I made the stop," he said, his voice raw. "I put the cuffs on. I did it because for 12 years, everything in my job, from my partners to my bosses to the awards on my wall, told me I was right to do it. The system created me." When it was over, he walked out of the federal building into the harsh afternoon sun. He felt stripped bare, like a man who had just confessed his sins to the entire world. He turned on his phone. The betrayal was instantaneous. The first text was from his old partner, a single word, "rat." Then a flood. Dozens of messages from numbers he knew. Pictures of rats. Threats, veiled and overt. "Watch your back. You're a dead man walking. Hope you can afford private security for your family." He saw a notification from a private Facebook group for Oakwood officers. It was a picture of his face with a red X through it. The caption read, "The cancer has been cut out." The official denouncement came that evening on the local news. There was Sal DeFranco, the union president, standing at a podium, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Frank Jensen is a traitor," Sal spat, jabbing his finger for emphasis. To save his own skin from a single, regrettable mistake, he has chosen to betray his brothers and sisters in blue. He has concocted a fantasy of systemic problems to appease the very people who seek to destroy law enforcement. This union does not and will not represent rats. He is no longer a police officer. He is no longer one of us. He is alone. Jensen watched the broadcast, the words washing over him. He was completely, utterly alone. He had been excommunicated from the only church he had ever known. Stripped of his badge, his gun, his career, and now his tribe. There was nothing left. It was rock bottom, a terrifying freefall into a void he couldn't see the end of. Yet in that void, there was a strange, terrible clarity. For the first time, there were no more lies to tell, no more codes to uphold, no more family to protect. There was only the stark, ugly truth of his actions and the system he had served. This complete and total devastation was not the end of his story. It was the brutal, painful, and necessary beginning of his accountability. Frank Jensen's deposition was not a pebble dropped into a pond, it was a boulder. The ripples it created became a tidal wave that crashed down on the Oakwood Police Department with the full, unyielding force of the federal government. Armed with an insider's confession that corroborated years of statistical data and citizen complaints, the Department of Justice no longer had to negotiate. They came to conquer. The hammer fell on a Tuesday morning. At a press conference held on the steps of the federal courthouse, the U.S. Attorney General herself stood at the podium. Behind her stood Judge Marcus Hayes, not as a participant, but as a silent, stoic witness to the sea change his family's ordeal had wrought. The Attorney General's words were precise, clinical, and brutal. Following an extensive investigation, she announced, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd of reporters, the Department of Justice has found a clear and pervasive pattern of unconstitutional policing by the Oakwood Police Department. She detailed a culture of racial bias, excessive force, and a systemic failure of accountability. Therefore, she continued, the Department of Justice is today imposing a legally binding consent decree on the city of Oakwood and its police force. For the Oakwood PD, it was a death sentence to their way of life. The consent decree wasn't a list of suggestions. It was a complete and total surrender of their autonomy. A court-appointed federal monitor would become the department's shadow, with the power to veto the chief's decisions, rewrite policy, and fire personnel. The reforms were sweeping and absolute. The union's contract, once a sacred shield for bad cops, was rendered nearly powerless in matters of discipline. Proactive policing was dead. In its place came mandatory, detailed data collection for every single civilian interaction, tracked and analyzed by federal statisticians for racial disparities. The use of force policy was rewritten from the ground up, emphasizing de-escalation as a primary, legally mandated duty. A civilian oversight board was established, not as a toothless advisory committee, but with full subpoena power and the authority to recommend termination directly to the federal monitor. Sal DeFranco, the union president, could only watch on television, his face a mask of impotent fury. His family had been subjugated by a bigger, more powerful one. The blue wall hadn't just been broken, it had been demolished, and the federal government was now rebuilding the entire precinct on its own terms. 3 weeks later, Frank Jensen stood before a federal judge for his sentencing. The courtroom was quiet. As part of his cooperation agreement, the most severe charges had been dropped, but his guilt was a matter of public record. The judge, a stern woman in her late 60s, looked down at him from the bench. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice echoing in the solemn space, "your actions were a stain on the badge you wore and a betrayal of the community you swore to protect. Prison would be a just and simple punishment. However, the U.S. Attorney's Office has proposed an alternative, one that they believe serves a greater purpose than mere retribution." The deal was unprecedented. Jensen would receive no prison time. Instead, he was sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation with a unique and demanding condition. He was to be assigned to the Department of Justice's new Police Reform and Accountability Task Force. He would not be a consultant or an advisor. He would be an object lesson. His new purpose was a peculiar and painful form of penance. He was tasked with helping a team of sociologists, legal scholars, and veteran reform-minded cops design the next generation of anti-bias and de-escalation training for police departments across the country. And the primary textbook for this new curriculum would be his own career. The final scene of his old life, and the first of his new one, took place a month later. Jensen sat in a sterile government conference room in Washington, D.C. He wore a gray suit that felt like a costume. Across from him sat the Reform Committee, a diverse group of sharp, analytical faces. On a massive screen at the front of the room, a video began to play. It was his own bodycam footage. He watched himself step out of his cruiser on that sunny afternoon. He heard his own voice, dripping with a condescending authority he barely recognized. He saw the faces of the Hayes triplets, saw their calm dignity, and saw his own escalating, irrational anger. He listened to himself laugh at the mention of their father. He saw his own hands reach for the handcuffs. "Okay, Frank," the task force leader said, pausing the video at the moment the steel cuffs clicked shut on Maya Hayes' wrist. "Let's start there. Walk us through your cognitive process. What were the assumptions? Where were the decision points? We need to understand the anatomy of this failure from the inside out." Jensen stared at the frozen image of his greatest shame, magnified 10 feet tall. This was his new reality. Not a prison cell, but a different kind of confinement. A life sentence of reliving, dissecting, and explaining his own sins, over and over, in the hope that some other cop, in some other town, might finally learn to see what he had been so blind to. While Frank Jensen was beginning his solitary penance in the sterile conference rooms of Washington, D.C., the Hayes family was forging a different kind of response. They refused to let their story be defined by what a biased officer had done to them. It would be defined by what they chose to do next. The injustice was a catalyst, not a conclusion. The transformation began not in a courtroom, but in the auditorium of Northwood Preparatory School. 6 months after the incident, the school held a community and justice assembly. The triplets were asked to sit in the front row, symbolic props of a problem the school now claimed to be addressing. As speaker after speaker talked about them, Anika leaned over to her sisters and whispered, "They're turning us into a museum exhibit. We're not a lesson, we're the teachers." That afternoon, they decided to take back their own narrative. They were not just the judge's daughters, they were Maya, Anika, and Lena Hayes. And they were a force to be reckoned with. They called their initiative the Triple Threat. The name was a defiant reclamation of the very idea that had gotten them arrested, that 3 young, intelligent black women could be perceived as a threat. Their mission was to turn that perception on its head, becoming a threat not to public safety, but to ignorance and injustice. Their goal was simple and revolutionary: to arm every teenager, especially those in marginalized communities, with the knowledge and tools to survive a police encounter. It became their obsession. Maya, the natural leader, designed and led Know Your Rights workshops. She used role-playing scenarios, teaching teens the precise, calm language to use with law enforcement, the phrases that assert rights without escalating tension. "Your silence is not a challenge to their authority," she would teach, her voice resonating with a wisdom far beyond her years. "It is your constitutional right." Anika, the analyst and tech genius, developed a free mobile app called Shield. It was a masterclass in pragmatic self-defense. With a single tap, the app would begin discreetly recording video and audio, live streaming it to a secure server, and alerting 3 pre-selected emergency contacts with the user's GPS location. Simultaneously, the phone screen would display a simple, clear script of the user's 4th and 5th Amendment rights, providing a real-time guide for a terrifying moment. Lena, the diplomat with a deep well of empathy, focused on the aftermath. She established a peer support network, connecting teens who had experienced traumatic police encounters. It was a space to share stories and dismantle the shame and fear that so often followed such incidents, reminding them that their trauma was valid and they were not alone. The triple threat exploded. What started as a school project became a local phenomenon, then a statewide movement. They were featured on national news, not as victims, but as young, powerful innovators. Civil rights organizations partnered with them, integrating the Shield app and their workshops into national youth outreach programs. The Hayes triplets had stepped out of their father's long shadow and were casting a powerful one of their own. Watching his daughters turn their pain into a national platform, Judge Marcus Hayes felt a profound sense of both pride and responsibility. He and his wife, Imani, had the resources, the connections, and the influence that most families could only dream of. Their children were safe because of who they were. But what about everyone else? That question gave birth to the Hayes Foundation for Justice and Healing. It was their answer, a powerful, 2-pronged mission to provide other families with the same impenetrable shield of support that had protected their own. Judge Hayes built the justice arm. He assembled a rapid response legal team, a network of the country's sharpest civil rights attorneys who would work pro bono. When a call came in about a child being wrongfully detained or an instance of police misconduct, the foundation wouldn't just send a lawyer. It would send a legal titan, the kind of representation that could make a city's legal department tremble. They gave the powerless the kind of power that could not be ignored. Dr. Imani Hayes, drawing on her deep understanding of trauma, built the healing arm. A legal victory is only half the battle, she would explain. You can win a lawsuit and still lose your child to PTSD, to fear, to a lifetime of looking over their shoulder. She created a network of trauma-informed therapists, counselors, and support groups, all provided free of charge to the families the foundation served. She designed spaces that felt like sanctuaries, not clinics, ensuring that the psychological wounds of injustice were treated with the same urgency and expertise as the legal ones. The work was their new legacy. The final scene of this act is not in a courtroom or a press conference. It's in a quiet, warmly lit office in the Hayes Foundation headquarters. A young mother, Maria, sits on a comfortable sofa, twisting a tissue in her hands. Her 15-year-old son had been arrested under circumstances chillingly similar to the Triplets. But this time, when she made her one phone call, it was to the Foundation's hotline. Now, sitting with her is Dr. Imani Hayes, not as a doctor, but as a fellow mother, listening with a profound, compassionate stillness. On her other side is a renowned constitutional lawyer, who gently explains that all charges against her son have been dropped and a formal investigation into the arresting officer has been launched. For the first time in a week, Maria breathes. She is not alone. She is not a victim begging for help. She is a mother who has been handed a sword and a shield, and she is ready to fight. The Hayes family wasn't just fixing a broken system. They were building a new one family at a time. 1 year, 12 months, a single orbit of the Earth around the sun. In Oakwood, it was an eternity. The consent decree had descended upon the police department not like a reform, but like an occupation. Federal monitors walked the precinct halls, their clipboards and sharp questions a constant reminder of the old guard's failure. The change was not smooth or celebrated. It was a grinding, painful process, met with sullen resistance and quiet sabotage. Yet, despite the friction, the numbers didn't lie. Citizen complaints were down 40%. Use of force incidents had plummeted. For the first time in a generation, traffic stop data showed no significant racial disparity. The city was not less safe. In fact, for many of its residents, it was finally becoming safer from its own police. The final scene of this chapter unfolded hundreds of miles away, in the cavernous, climate-controlled ballroom of a Las Vegas hotel. It was the annual conference of the National Association of Police Chiefs, a gathering of the old guard, the law and order titans from every corner of the country. The air was thick with the scent of steak dinners, expensive cologne, and a deep, simmering resentment for the changing world. The keynote speaker for the 21st Century Challenge's breakout session was not a celebrated criminologist or a tough-on-crime politician. It was Frank Jensen. He walked to the podium, a man utterly transformed. The swagger was gone, replaced by a slight stoop in his shoulders, as if carrying an invisible weight. He was gaunt, thinner than he'd been in years, the flesh stripped away by stress and a year of relentless self-examination. He wore a simple dark suit, a civilian in a room of uniforms and authority. But as he looked out at the sea of skeptical, hostile faces, men with crossed arms and stony glares who saw him as the ultimate traitor, his eyes held something he never had as a cop, a raw, undeniable, and deeply unsettling authority. It was the authority of a man who had been through the fire and had come back to testify about the flames. "Good morning," he began, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent, tense room. "My name is Frank Jensen. I was a police officer for 12 years. I received multiple commendations. I was named Top Patrolman of the Year. And I was a danger to the community I swore to protect." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm not here to talk to you about implicit bias as a textbook theory," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the hard stares without flinching. "I'm here to talk about it as a weapon. For years, I called my bias instinct. I called my profiling proactive policing. I saw a black teenager in a nice car, and my instinct told me drug dealer, not honor student. I saw a Hispanic man in a work truck, and my instinct told me illegal, not father of 3. These weren't instincts. They were failures, and the system I worked for rewarded me for them, right up until the day they destroyed my life." He clicked a remote, and a single, damning statistic from his own career flashed on the screen behind him. "We talk a lot about officer safety," Jensen said, his voice gaining strength. "But we never talk about the safety we lose when the community sees us as an occupying army instead of a part of them. The single most dangerous thing for a cop is a citizen who is too scared to talk to them. And we create that fear every time we make a stop based on what someone looks like instead of what they've done. I didn't learn that in a classroom. I learned it when I put handcuffs on 3 innocent girls, and in doing so, handcuffed my own future. He spoke for 20 minutes, his words a brutal, honest, and undeniable confession. He didn't ask for sympathy. He demanded recognition. He was a ghost of their own making, a reflection of the quiet sins many in that room had justified as just part of the job. As he finished, a profound and heavy silence filled the ballroom. It was not the silence of agreement, but of stunned, uncomfortable contemplation. Jensen's eyes, weary but clear, scanned the back of the room. And then he saw him. Leaning against the back wall, almost hidden in the shadows, stood Judge Marcus Hayes. He was dressed not as a judge, but as a father in a simple sports coat. He had not come to gloat or to judge. He had come to witness. Their eyes met across the vast, silent space. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. In Jensen's eyes, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the ruin he had caused and the painful, inadequate path he now walked. In the judge's eyes, there was the unerasable memory of his daughter's humiliation and a year spent fighting to build something better from the wreckage. Then, Judge Hayes did something that no one else in the room could see. He gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. Forgiveness was a grace Jensen had not earned, and the judge was not yet ready to grant. It was not a nod of friendship or absolution. It was something far more profound. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a recognition that the man on the stage, the architect of his family's pain, was now, however flawed, a part of the solution. It was a sign that while the damage could never be truly undone, the grueling, painful, and necessary process of building something better had, against all odds, truly begun. It was, in its own way, a quiet, final, and undeniable measure of justice.